Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Right now, less than 200 miles off the coast of Venezuela, a specific class of U.S. Navy ship is moving into position. It is not a destroyer. It is not a patrol vessel. It is an amphibious assault ship, a platform designed for only one mission, putting Marines onto hostile ground. For nearly 20 years, the Southern Caribbean was treated as quiet space. No invasion plans, no forward bases, no reason to rush. But satellite imagery over Puerto Rico tells a different story. Runways once overgrown are being resurfaced. Fuel depots are being expanded. Airports built for tourists are being reinforced for heavy military traffic. This is not patrol behavior. This is not deterrence by presence. This is rehearsal. And rehearsals happen when planners believe they may soon need to act. Among all the U.S. military assets now appearing around Venezuela, amphibious assault ships are the most revealing. They are not flexible tools. They are not symbolic platforms. They exist for one purpose: moving large numbers of Marines from sea to land in contested territory. From the Pentagon's perspective, deploying such a ship immediately narrows the range of possible explanations. Destroyers can be justified as missile defense. Surveillance aircraft can be explained away as monitoring. Amphibious ships cannot. They are expensive to operate, impossible to hide, and politically difficult to walk back once deployed. These vessels carry thousands of Marines, along with helicopters, V-22 Ospreys, and landing craft designed to seize ports, airfields, and coastal infrastructure. They are not designed for long patrols. They are designed for short, violent windows of action. When they enter a theater, it means land-based scenarios are no longer hypothetical. This does not automatically mean an invasion is imminent. Amphibious ships are often used as leverage, a way to signal seriousness without pulling the trigger. But leverage only works if the threat behind it is credible, and credibility requires preparation down to the last detail: air cover, missile defense, logistics, and timing. In the Venezuelan case, the likely targets are not mysterious: ports that handle oil exports, airports that control airspace, communication hubs that coordinate resistance. Taking these nodes does not require occupying the country. It requires speed, surprise, and overwhelming local superiority. That is why the amphibious presence matters more than any single statement or press release. It tells adversaries that Washington is no longer asking whether force could be used. It is asking under what conditions it would be effective, and what must be in place beforehand. Once that question is being seriously considered, the crisis has already entered a new phase. The amphibious ships explain how an invasion could happen. They do not explain why it is being considered now. For that, planners look beyond Venezuela itself. The real trigger is not Caracas. It is the growing presence of external powers willing to turn Venezuela into a strategic platform. For years, Russian and Chinese involvement in Venezuela was treated as manageable. Arms sales, advisors, occasional port visits. These were signals of alignment, not transformation. What changed was the trajectory. Intelligence assessments began to point toward permanence rather than symbolism. Shared facilities, expanded access agreements, and the quiet normalization of foreign military activity in a country sitting at the northern edge of South America. From Washington's perspective, this crosses a different line. A temporary partner is one thing. A persistent military foothold in the Southern Caribbean is another. Geography compresses reaction time. Assets stationed in Venezuela would not be facing outward toward the Atlantic. They would be facing north, toward shipping lanes, energy routes, and U.S. territory itself. Russia's role is especially destabilizing. Even without formal bases, Moscow can shift the balance through asymmetric tools: intelligence sharing, electronic warfare support, and the transfer of long-range or loitering drones introduce persistent threats at low cost. A drone does not need to win a battle. It only needs to force defenses to stay active, airfields to stay hardened, and planners to assume constant surveillance. China's involvement carries a different kind of weight. Beijing does not need to deploy troops to matter. Infrastructure access, port management, satellite cooperation, and dual-use facilities can quietly expand operational reach. What looks civilian on paper can become military in practice with minimal warning. That ambiguity is precisely what concerns U.S. planners the most. The danger is not a sudden showdown. It is normalization. Once foreign military access in Venezuela becomes routine, reversing it becomes politically and strategically costly. Every year that passes locks in a new reality. From the Pentagon's perspective, waiting carries more risk than acting early. This is why the response has not been limited to diplomacy. Statements and warnings do little once external powers believe the cost of staying is low. What changes behavior is the prospect that access will be contested and that escalation will not be one-sided. At that point, Venezuela stops being the center of the story. It becomes the terrain. The real contest shifts to whether the United States is willing to enforce the boundaries it has long claimed, or whether it will accept a gradual erosion of its strategic depth. Once that question is taken seriously, planning moves quickly from theory to timelines. If planners decide that pressure has failed and delay carries greater risk than action, the opening phase would be defined by speed and disorientation. The objective would not be conquest, it would be paralysis. For the first 72 hours, the goal would be to deny the Venezuelan government the ability to coordinate, respond, or appeal for outside intervention in real time. The sequence would begin before the first missile is launched. Cyber operations and electronic warfare would target communications networks, military command links, and key civilian infrastructure tied to regime control. Radar systems would begin to degrade. Military units would lose reliable contact with central command. Confusion, not destruction, would be the opening weapon. Within hours, long-range strikes would follow. Cruise missiles launched from ships and aircraft outside Venezuelan airspace would hit known air defense sites, radar installations, and command facilities near major population centers and airfields. These strikes would be precise and limited, aimed at opening corridors rather than flattening cities. The purpose would be to remove the most dangerous threats quickly, before they could be relocated or activated fully. As defenses begin to fracture, stealth aircraft would move in. F-35s would penetrate airspace to confirm damage, suppress surviving missile systems, and establish air superiority over key regions. This phase would not be visible to most of the population. It would happen at altitude, at speed, and largely at night. But its effects would be immediate. Venezuelan aircraft would be grounded. Radar coverage would become unreliable. The airspace would no longer be contested in any meaningful way. Only after control of the air is established would the most visible move occur. Amphibious forces, already positioned offshore, would begin their approach. Marines would target a small number of critical locations, ports that handle fuel and exports, airfields capable of receiving reinforcements, and communication hubs that tie the country together. These would not be symbolic landings. They would be surgical seizures designed to deny the regime its most valuable nodes. Throughout this phase, speed would matter more than scale. The objective would be to present the Venezuelan leadership with a reality that has already shifted before a coherent response can form. Every hour gained reduces the effectiveness of militia mobilization, cartel coordination, and foreign advisory support. By the end of the first 72 hours, the question would no longer be whether the United States can project force. That would already be evident. The question would be whether the regime can reorganize fast enough to turn endurance into resistance, or whether the window for meaningful control has already closed. For the first 72 hours to work, the invasion scenario depends on something more basic than courage or numbers. It depends on a kill chain that functions faster than Venezuela can react. Every asset already positioned in the Caribbean exists to shorten decision time on the U.S. side while stretching it on the other. At sea, the destroyers are not there to announce an attack. They are there to survive one. Ships equipped with advanced missile defense systems form a moving shield around the task force, designed to intercept any anti-ship missiles launched from the coast. Their presence signals a sober expectation. Retaliation is anticipated, not dismissed. The objective is not dominance by intimidation, but dominance by denial. Other vessels focus on blinding rather than blocking. Electronic warfare platforms degrade radar coverage and disrupt communications along the coast, forcing Venezuelan commanders to operate with partial information. In modern conflict, uncertainty is often more damaging than firepower. A unit that cannot see clearly cannot decide quickly, and a delayed decision is often as fatal as a wrong one. Above the fleet, the air picture tightens. Surveillance aircraft map radar emissions, track aircraft movement, and identify mobile launchers. This information feeds directly into strike platforms, collapsing the time between detection and engagement. What looks like overwhelming force from the outside is, internally, an effort to eliminate hesitation. Long-range bombers remain on standby throughout this phase. Their role is not constant bombardment, but insurance. If a hardened facility survives initial strikes, or if new targets emerge, cruise missiles can be launched from thousands of miles away without repositioning forces. This ensures that momentum is not lost while decisions are debated. Closer to the fight, tactical aircraft operate from newly reactivated bases. Fighters take off, refuel in the air, strike, and return without leaving the region. This tempo matters. It allows sustained pressure without pause, preventing Venezuelan forces from regrouping or adapting between waves. What ties these elements together is integration. Ships, aircraft, and surveillance platforms are not acting independently. They are linked in real time, sharing data and updating priorities continuously. The result is not chaos, but compression. Venezuela's response window narrows with every hour, while the U.S. decision loop accelerates. This is why the naval and air posture looks defensive on paper. It is designed to absorb shocks without losing coherence. In an invasion scenario, coherence is the real weapon. Without it, even superior forces become vulnerable. With it, momentum becomes extremely difficult to stop. The invasion scenario does not begin offshore. It is sustained from land, and no single location matters more to that sustainment than Puerto Rico. For nearly 2 decades, Roosevelt Roads Naval Station was treated as a relic of an older era. Its closure in 2004 reflected the belief that the United States no longer needed a permanent forward hub in the Southern Caribbean. That belief has now been quietly reversed. Satellite imagery shows runways resurfaced, fuel storage expanded, and hangars reactivated. This is not cosmetic maintenance. It is operational restoration. From a Pentagon planning perspective, Puerto Rico solves a problem that ships and long-range bombers cannot. It provides persistence. Aircraft flying from the continental United States can strike, but they cannot remain. Carrier decks offer mobility, but they are finite. A land base allows fighters, drones, and tankers to operate continuously, cycling in and out without breaking tempo. This matters most in the days after the initial strikes. Once air defenses are suppressed and amphibious forces move ashore, the conflict shifts from shock to control. Surveillance must be constant. Interdiction must be relentless. Any pause gives Venezuelan militias time to reorganize and cartel network space to adapt. Puerto Rico enables pressure without interruption. The choice of location is not accidental. As U.S. territory, Puerto Rico removes political uncertainty at the worst possible moment. There are no basing negotiations to reopen, no allied governments weighing domestic backlash. Orders can be executed immediately. In a crisis defined by speed, that reliability becomes strategic advantage. From Roosevelt Roads, F-35s can reach Venezuelan airspace in minutes. MQ-9 Reapers can loiter for hours, tracking movements that would otherwise disappear into jungle or urban sprawl. Tanker aircraft extend every sortie, allowing fighters to stay on station instead of retreating to refuel. The air war becomes continuous rather than episodic. The same logic applies to logistics. Heavy transport aircraft moving through Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands can deliver ammunition, vehicles, and personnel at a scale no ship alone can match. Sustained operations depend on flow. Once flow is established, escalation no longer hinges on improvisation. This is why the reactivation of Puerto Rico matters more than any single ship or aircraft. It signals that planners are not preparing for a short demonstration or a limited strike. They are preparing for endurance. And endurance only makes sense if leaders believe the conflict, once begun, may not resolve quickly. Long before the first Marine steps onto Venezuelan soil, the invasion plan relies on something quieter, but just as decisive: money. Modern wars are rarely fought on the battlefield alone. They are fought through cash flow, access to markets, and the ability of a government to keep paying the people who enforce its authority. For Venezuela, that vulnerability is concentrated in one place. Oil exports are not simply an economic sector. They are the regime's lifeline. Revenue from petroleum funds imports stabilizes the currency and sustains the security services that keep the government in power. Disrupt that flow, and every other system begins to strain. This is why maritime interdictions matter. When U.S. Coast Guard units intercept and seize oil tankers leaving Venezuelan waters, the action is not symbolic. It is deliberate pressure applied below the threshold of declared war. Each seized shipment reduces available cash while signaling that access to global markets is no longer guaranteed. From Washington's perspective, this phase serves multiple purposes at once. It weakens the regime financially, it tests international reactions, and it conditions the environment before any kinetic action begins. Economic warfare is cheaper, quieter, and politically easier to scale than military force. But it is also slow. That slowness is its limitation. Sanctions and interdictions rarely produce immediate collapse, especially when leaders frame the pressure as external aggression. In many cases, they harden internal resolve rather than fracture it. U.S. planners understand this. That is why economic pressure is not expected to win the conflict by itself. Instead, it is meant to narrow options. As cash reserves shrink, the regime's ability to pay militias, secure loyalty, and absorb disruption erodes. The longer the pressure continues, the more brittle the system becomes. By the time military operations begin, the government is already operating under strain. This sequencing matters. If force is used, it will not arrive into a stable economic environment. It will arrive into one already weakened, already uncertain, already struggling to respond coherently. Economic warfare sets the conditions so that when momentum shifts, it shifts quickly. In this sense, the invasion plan is not defined by a single dramatic moment. It is defined by preparation layered over time. By the time the landing begins, the battle for endurance has already been underway for weeks. From Washington's perspective, the invasion scenario looks controlled, deliberate, and asymmetric in its favor. From Caracas, it looks very different. Venezuelan planners are not preparing to defeat the United States in a conventional sense. They are preparing to endure it. The Venezuelan military understands the imbalance. It cannot contest U.S. air superiority or naval control head-on. Instead, its strategy is built around delay, dispersion, and political cost. Layered air defenses, even if technologically inferior, are positioned to survive initial strikes and force repeated targeting. Mobility matters more than lethality. Every hour gained is a form of resistance. Militia forces are central to this approach. Numbering in the millions, they are embedded in cities, towns, and civilian infrastructure. These units are not meant to maneuver like an army. They are meant to complicate occupation, blur combatant lines, and make rapid stabilization impossible. Their value lies in persistence, not coordination. Criminal networks reinforce this structure. Cartels operating along the coast and in the interior provide logistics, smuggling routes, and local intelligence. Fast boats, jungle corridors, and informal supply chains allow activity to continue even when formal infrastructure is seized. These networks are difficult to dismantle without prolonged presence and political fallout. For U.S. planners, this means speed is not just an advantage, it is a necessity. The longer operations extend, the more effective Venezuelan asymmetric resistance becomes. Urban density, terrain, and civilian overlap steadily erode technological superiority. What begins as a precision operation risks becoming an endurance contest. This reality shapes American restraint as much as American power. The objective is not to chase every militia unit or dismantle every cartel route. It is to prevent these forces from coalescing into a unified resistance that drags the conflict into a prolonged phase. Control of ports, airfields, and communications is meant to deny that consolidation. Understanding the enemy's plan clarifies the urgency behind U.S. preparation. This is not a war Washington wants to fight slowly. It is one it believes must be decided before endurance becomes resistance. At this stage, the logic driving U.S. behavior becomes clearer. The buildup is not about eagerness for conflict. It is about avoiding a worse one later. From the Pentagon's risk assessment, delay carries costs that grow over time. Every month that passes allows external actors to deepen their involvement. Advisors become routine. Access agreements normalize. Dual-use infrastructure quietly hardens into military utility. What begins as influence becomes presence, and presence becomes permanence. Reversing that progression is far harder than preventing it. At the same time, Venezuela's internal systems adapt to pressure. Sanctions are bypassed, smuggling networks evolve, militias gain experience operating under strain. The longer the standoff continues, the less brittle the regime becomes. Time, in this case, does not heal the problem, it entrenches it. This creates a narrowing window. Act too early, and the costs are political. Act too late, and the costs are strategic. U.S. planners are attempting to position themselves at the point where action, if taken, would be fastest, most controlled, and least likely to spiral outward. That is why preparation appears excessive from the outside. It is not calibrated for the present moment. It is calibrated for the moment when restraint fails. Once that moment arrives, there is no time to build bases, move ships, or secure logistics. Those decisions must already be complete. In that sense, the visible buildup is not escalation. It is insurance. It preserves options rather than forcing them. The paradox of deterrence is that it requires readiness to act, even when action is not yet chosen. By preparing early, Washington is trying to ensure that if force is used, it will be decisive rather than reactive. And if force is never used, the preparation itself may have done its job. From the outside, it is tempting to look for a single moment when the United States decided to prepare for invasion. In reality, no such moment exists. What exists is accumulation. Economic pressure that strains but does not resolve. External involvement that expands but does not announce itself. Military assets that arrive one by one, each defensible on its own but unmistakable in combination. Together, they create a situation where inaction becomes its own decision. The United States is not preparing because war is inevitable. It is preparing because the cost of being unprepared has risen beyond what planners consider acceptable. In the Southern Caribbean, distance no longer guarantees safety, and assumptions made after the Cold War no longer hold. This is why dormant bases are reactivated, amphibious ships are positioned, and air logistics are restored, not to signal aggression, but to recover flexibility that was once taken for granted. Preparation restores choice. It prevents a crisis from dictating outcomes on its own terms. If conflict comes, it will not begin with a declaration. It will begin with systems already in motion. If conflict does not come, those systems will remain as silent deterrents, shaping behavior without firing a shot. That is the quiet logic behind what looks like invasion planning. The United States is not announcing a war plan. It is rebuilding the ability to act in a region it once assumed would never require it again. When that assumption disappears, preparation stops being optional. It becomes the only responsible response to an increasingly narrow set of alternatives.